Welcome to the Black Hat Testimonies. I'm Adam Shostak. I'll be chairing this session. And my constituents tell me that they are very concerned about data privacy. They're very concerned about identity theft. And this morning, I'd like to thank my fellow committee members for being here. We have Congresswoman Michelle Dragon, formerly from Motorola Corporation, who will be joining us. And we have Congressman Mark McGovern, the very first congressman to leave In-Q-Tel and become a congressman from the great territory of the District of Columbia. They will be asking questions of our excellent group of experts, who I'd like to thank for coming here to educate us this morning. We appreciate the opportunity to hear from these distinguished ladies and gentlemen. And to begin with, I'd like to yield the floor to Mr. Joseph Ancinelli, the CEO of Vontu, who's a well-known advocate for privacy. He's, in addition to his many duties as CEO, he's presented to Congress twice in the last 12 months. And so, Mr. Ancinelli. Could we increase the volume a little bit? Yeah, why don't you come up here?
Morning, everybody. Everyone have enough coffee? You want to go get some real quick? It's like the lopsided room here. I'm thinking that it's because everyone wants some quick access to caffeine. Let me just start by asking a question, actually. Who's been a victim of identity theft? Anybody? Someone stolen a credit card? Yeah. So they asked us to go through some testimony. So I took some testimony that I did last December. So we'll go through that. As Adam said, my name is Joseph Ancinelli. I'm CEO of a company called Vontu, which is an information security company that I started about 2.5 years ago. And we provide software basically to help organizations and companies deal with the loss of data over the internet. So it's really focused on the insider and making sure that people are handling data as appropriately as possible. I've testified twice in the last 12 months before Congress on the issue of data security, and primarily around consumer data and the risks for consumers with respect to identity theft. I've probably met with about 100 members of Congress, staff, and policymakers on this issue, and I'm glad that we're having this session and panel here today. First, I actually want to congratulate and comment on the fact that actually Congress is starting to do some things. It takes a long time, and it's about 2 weeks ago, Congress and the President passed a new law around identity theft that actually, for the first time, started to deal with the issue around insiders. Because the reality is that most security breaches happen because people have access to data, and it's really easy once you have access to do things with it. And they passed a law called the Identity Theft Penalty Enhancement Act, which was originally proposed in the House by Representative John Carter. And basically, this law increases the penalties for insiders who use their legitimate access to network resources to steal information and use it in identity theft crimes. Makes it basically a 5-year felony, mandatory if you do that. And the legislation is definitely a great step forward. It puts the focus of the sanctions where it should be, which is on the criminal and the individual that steals the data. But perhaps more importantly, the law will become a stepping stone, hopefully, for additional federal action designed to bring better data protection to corporate networks. Many of the members of Congress that I've spoken to since the President signed the law said they'd like to see additional things around data protection happening next year. And I applaud the interest of the committees and the Congress to pursue it, but I also always encourage Congress to move very cautiously in adopting an approach that rewards companies and incents companies and creates a partnership with companies to solve this problem. I think that all too often we try to hit people with a big stick and we don't provide them any incentives to try to do the right thing. The question that was put forth before the first panel was around what's at risk for consumers with respect to consumer data, with respect to data security. And it's pretty simple. It's all about identity theft. Last year, the FTC estimated that about 10 million people in the US were victims of identity theft. And on average, each victim loses about $500, which totals about $5 billion in out-of-pocket expenses that just goes right outside of our economy. And in the last 5 years, about 30 million people were victims, which is about 1 in 10, which is a high number. And it's not getting any better. And what's interesting is there's also a lot of new evidence about where identity theft, how it's happening. There was a study done by Dr. Judith Collins at Michigan State. They actually have an identity theft crime lab that follows and tracks identity theft and tries to understand how is it happening, what's the cause, what's the impact. Over the last 3 or 4 years, she's looked at about 4,000 identity theft cases. And using police records, trial evidence, and other publicly available sources, and some not publicly available, she has determined that about 70% of all identity theft is caused by insiders stealing information from their employer. And she knows because she actually started the lab because she was a victim of identity theft herself. So, huge risk for consumers in terms of the impact of ID theft, but it's also a huge risk for businesses as well. The same exact study that I referenced from the FTC talked about the fact that businesses, in terms of the fraud that they have to basically, the expense of the fraud that they have to incur, it's about $50 billion a year. And that's not something you can very easily mitigate. Someone said probably more. Way more, okay, all right. The thing that, there's all those hard costs, but the other thing that impacts corporations is the fact that if your data is stolen, the thing that you actually probably lose the most is actually consumer trust. And we did a survey and a study last November of about 1,000 consumers in the United States. And we were trying to understand the effect of security on decisions around purchasing. And some of the findings were pretty interesting. The first thing was that people definitely think about security when they make a purchasing decision. They think about putting their credit card forward and say, do I trust this company who I'm going to give my credit card to? About 75% of the people said that was one of the top things that they do think about before they make a purchase. And I think consumers will definitely speak with their wallets. About half of the folks said they would move their business to another company if they didn't have confidence in the security that they used for protecting their own data. And what was particularly interesting was that if there was ever a breach where an insider was involved, it would have a much greater impact on people's trust in the company than if someone broke into their networks. Because their view is that, if they're hiring people and the people that they're hiring aren't doing a good job of protecting the data, that's actually even worse than someone breaking into their networks. So clearly financial loss and the loss of consumer trust is a big issue as a result of identity theft. So the question is, what do we do about it, and what's the risk, and how do you start to deal with the problem? And what do we know? What other data do we have about dealing with the insider? The issue that I start to tell people in Congress, and it's funny they don't really think about this, is that every day companies throughout this country and around the world are creating and storing millions and millions and millions of records about every single transaction and other financial information that we do every day. Social security numbers, credit card numbers, other types of non-public personal information. And at most of these companies, lots and lots of employees have legitimate access to that data. And this has created, I call it the perfect storm of data security. You've got huge repositories of consumer data. You've got people with lots and lots of access who typically also then have access to the internet. And so I think folks are probably pretty familiar with some recent cases. For example, not to pick on them, and AOL is a good company, but they had an insider who was basically figured out how to get 90 million member names out of their database and was paid $100,000 to do it. 23-year-old kid, he got someone's password from someone else who worked and had access to the data, and he sold the data to an international spam operator. Good thing is they caught him, but it turns out that not only did he have member names, but he'd also had gotten telephone numbers, addresses. He didn't actually get credit card numbers because that was stored in a different database. But it sort of demonstrates how easy it is to steal vast quantities of data. Another case was a company called Teledata, and it was someone in their customer service department. And Teledata would provide credit reporting services, actually. And he, over a period of about 2 years, was being paid $60 for every credit report that he would basically send outside of the company to this crime ring. So he ended up getting about $2 million until he was caught. And I thought it was actually quite interesting to have a little aside of how he was caught. It turns out they figured out that some data had been compromised because I don't know if it was his girlfriend or some friend, had called up Macy's or Bloomingdale's and ordered 1,000 pairs of shoes. And that wasn't too unusual. I guess, sometimes Nordstrom's, they get a lot of orders for shoes. The question they asked was, what size do you want? And she said, doesn't matter. So that was probably not the smartest thing to do. But, Teledata and AOL are two of the largest identity theft crimes that have been uncovered by federal authorities. However, I'm convinced that these crimes are continuing every day, and as someone pointed out, it's actually probably a lot higher cost than we even know. And law enforcement definitely understands it. At one of the early testimonies I did, Special Agent Tim Cadigan from the Secret Service testified that they've actually set up organizations specifically to monitor identity theft, because identity theft is becoming one of the principal ways of funding organized crime as well as terrorism. If you can steal $3,000 to $5,000 a pop and sort of stay under the radar, and you do that over and over again, it's actually a good way to finance those kind of activities. And Howard Beals, who's the director of the FTC's Bureau of Consumer Protection, said that the FTC continues to see evidence that insiders were stealing consumer data at an increasing rate. So what I thought was also very interesting is TransUnion, one of the big sort of credit agencies, actually came out publicly with a report that said that the top cause of identity theft is now theft of records from employers. I thought maybe it'd be interesting to see how many of those actually came from themselves. But the problem of better protecting consumer data is no longer just an issue of keeping someone from breaking into a network. It is really thinking about those that have access to the data for legitimate purposes doing legitimate things. So what have we proposed? What do we suggest? I mean, there's lots of things you need to do to solve this problem, and I don't think that the government alone can solve it. I mean, far from it. I'm not a big believer that the government can solve a lot of problems, but I think that there's some things that they can do to help. To me, it's clear that we need some new efforts to minimize the growing risk. And I don't think that just having regulations which are a big stick are the right approach. I think that you really need to build a partnership between government and industry with both the carrot and the stick. I've proposed, as well as other folks, that the Commerce Committees propose and develop a consumer data security standard, some nationalized standard around how people should be protecting this data. There's a bunch of bills. There's one called the Consumer Privacy Protection Act from the House, Bill number 1636, which would be a good vehicle for this. And the goal is to have a national and unified and standardized approach to protecting consumer data. It should be something that is fairly self-regulating with oversight from the appropriate agencies when there's an incident. And it really has to focus on a couple of key things. I think one is making sure that people protect and ensure the confidentiality of non-public data. I think it's way too easy for a lot of our data to be accessed by other people. I mean, you go on Google and you can find lots of stuff about people. If you buy a house, you can find all kinds of information about people. So I think that that's really important. The data needs to be better protected. And I think that organizations need to have a responsibility to actually actively detect potential misuse of that data, whether that's people emailing it, putting it onto CDs, whatever, and ensure that their employees are complying with their own data security policies and correct the problems as they happen. What's interesting is these are actually the same requirements, very similar requirements that are mandated under things like Gramm Leach Bliley and HIPAA, but they only affect certain industries. They only affect financial services and healthcare. And the question I always ask is there something unique about a bank that has my social security number versus an energy company or utility company that has my social security number? Why is it that the bank needs to protect my social security number, but if I get a cell phone and they ask for my social security number or my credit card number, they don't have the same obligation to protect it in the same way? It doesn't seem to make sense. So the other thing that I think is also very important is notification is a big part of it. The data is ours. It's information about me. It's information about you. I think that, perfect. I think that it's really important that companies have an obligation to notify us when there's an issue that might impact us. And I think that the California law is good because it's raised awareness. I don't think that the structure of the law is very good. And I think that more should be done there. So that's sort of the stick. That's a little bit about how you sort of enforce people to do stuff. And I think the other part that you need to do is you need to give people the carrot. And as I mentioned earlier, I think that better partnership between government and business is required. What I propose is basically having a safe harbor that encourages companies to go beyond any basic data security standards. So for example, if you're doing best practices or even beyond best practices, they should have some sort of a safe harbor against civil lawsuits and torts and things like that. And then I think this approach of the carrot and stick would not only encourage most companies to adopt new consumer data security standards more quickly, it would actually free government resources to go after the people that are actually the offenders. So in closing, the increasing cost of ID theft with the consumers' increased demands for security protections, I think are really driving these issues to the top of the agenda for consumers, for legislators, for companies. And I think if more is not done by all parties involved, the costs are only going to continue to grow. And my concern is that it will actually have an impact on our economy overall. I mean, 2/3 of our economy is driven from consumer spending. So if identity theft gets worse and worse and worse, and there's even a small impact on consumer spending, it can have a big impact on the economy. So I hope these comments were helpful, and I look forward to questions from the committee as well as the audience later. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Before we take questions, I'd like to yield the floor to Marianne Davidson, who's the Chief Security Officer for Oracle Corporation.
Oops. Doesn't it? Can you hear me? Good. Good morning. It's been my great privilege to testify in front of the House, I believe 4 times on the issues of cybersecurity and once to the Senate. My remarks will be an update of the testimony I gave to the House Energy and Commerce Committee. And my approach focus is a little bit different than privacy. It more deals with the underlying safety and security of the computer systems which enable privacy. As you know, security is not privacy, but it is certainly necessary for privacy. I believe we've actually reached a tipping point in our discussions of cybersecurity when the Business Roundtable, as it did in May, issued, which is CEOs of about the 150 largest companies in America, issued a rather stinging indictment of the IT industry for the lack of security engendered by effectively poor programming practice. This included not only the cost of viruses, but the cost of breaches. This is the moral equivalent of a chief executive saying, we're mad as hell and we're not going to take it anymore. So instead of reading about worms and viruses and the cost of poor security in trade publications, on blogs, and in industry conferences, we're now seeing that this is a board-level issue. This is definitely a tipping point in the discussion of cybersecurity. One of the requirements for improved cybersecurity is to actually change the culture of the IT industry so that security, safety, and reliability becomes as important as new features. And until that happens, not much is going to change. One of the ways that things can change is for consumers to be smarter purchasers. And I'm certainly not blaming the victim here and saying it's your fault that you didn't ask for it before. But purchasing power definitely makes a difference in what is brought to market. The federal government in particular can be an extremely good focus for good because they are a very large purchaser of IT. They have billions of dollars to work on it, to spend on it, and after all, the uses for which IT is put includes national security. What is more important, you might ask, than cybersecurity for purchasing criterion? In fact, the federal government has acted to make security a purchasing criterion, specifically through a national security policy with the melodic acronym of NSTSIP 11, which is National Security, Telecommunications, and Information System Security Policy number 11, which says that anything used in a national security system has to have an independent security evaluation against FIPS or the common criteria. Why is this important? Because every vendor says, we're secure, trust us. No one will say our product has holes big enough to drive the QE2 through, but buy it anyway. So it's only if you have someone independently vet the software claims can you have any confidence that the product security mechanisms perform as advertised. And in fact, since NSTSIP has gone into effect, and since it started being enforced through the Defense Authorization Bill, we have certainly seen, we Oracle have certainly seen a number of people start to put their products through evaluations. And vendors have also sponsored evaluations of open source products. Right? It shouldn't be a religious issue of the security of open source versus proprietary software, because open source is here to stay. Let's make it as secure as possible. We are a big believer in security evaluations. We have 18 of them to date. But we certainly feel that this is not, evaluations are not perfect. I had the privilege recently of being a co-chair of the task force in the National Cybersecurity Partnership that was focused on technical standards and common criteria. And one of the recommendations we made was that while evaluations will vet security claims, they will show you that a product of type X meets the particular threats that product X is supposed to meet with certain degrees of confidence. But what it doesn't do is tell you whether the product is free of unintended consequences, which you all know as big honking security holes. So only if vulnerability assessment is not done except higher levels of assurance. So our recommendation was that vulnerability assessment, one of two things, either be brought to a lower level so that everyone does it, or that it be otherwise made a procurement requirement by the federal government. Their corollary to this was that the federal government needs to invest resources in fostering the growth of code scanning software, because trying to go through 5.3 million lines of code a night, which is how big one of our product code bases is, it's impossible. And even if you train people, they get it, they've got the security tattoo, people still make mistakes, and it can cost you millions to remedy them. We need automated tools, and it needs to be part of a procurement process or a common criteria evaluation. If industry has the tools to do this, it's automated, and it's a procurement requirement, no one can argue that it's unfair or that only big vendors can do it or only small vendors can do it. It needs to be something that everyone does. That was one of our key recommendations. Another key recommendation, in a way in which the government or other consumers can influence and drive the software industry to better product, is to make secure by default a procurement requirement. And why is this? Hackers know that you're not going to bother breaking the security mechanism of a product if you can walk in through the front door because somebody didn't change the password. It is perfectly reasonable and appropriate that every product that's sold to a large customer base, or perhaps even a small customer base, be secure by default and have an automated tool that can automate that hardening. Because without that, it's the equivalent of buying a car, driving off the lot, and realizing that you have to manually configure the brakes to work and manually configure the airbag so it will deploy if you need it. That is clearly a ridiculous requirement. The government can change things. Large customers can change things by demanding secure by default as a procurement requirement. Another topic area in which I think we can change industry for the better. If any of you have had to cross a bridge recently, you never worried about the safety, security, and reliability of that bridge. You didn't worry about getting the blue bridge of death. And the reason for that is that engineers know that they are building physical infrastructure and has to be safe, secure, and reliable. Software developers don't know that, or they don't care. If civil engineers built bridges the way developers build software, you'd hear arguments like, well, gee, I'm sorry the bridge crumbled, but I didn't expect so many trucks to be going over it. Or, well, we'll add rebar later, even though the concrete's already set. Or, structural engineering, that's just not an interesting problem or elegant. And you never hear this from engineers. One of the problems with the software industry is that, it has now become infrastructure technology, and it needs to be as safe, secure, and reliable as physical infrastructure, which means that people need to be accountable for their actions. Engineers are professionally licensed, and while everyone who works on a bridge isn't responsible for it, someone is. The structural engineer is licensed, and if that bridge collapses because he or she didn't do the right thing, someone's on the hook for it. In the software industry, no one's on the hook. So while I'm not advocating that every single person who ever writes a line of code or puts an HTML page together should have to have a professional license, clearly we need some structure where people are trained and accountable and know that their job is to make IT systems safe, secure, and reliable. And to those who argue that this will stifle creativity, I say that architects are tremendously creative within the bounds of building codes, sound structural engineering, cost, location, and customer preferences. There's plenty of room for creativity with accountability, safety, and reliability. Lastly, I would encourage continued public and private partnership, because the issue of cybersecurity is greater than one vendor, one researcher, one entity, or one customer. It's only by banding together in things such as the National Cybersecurity Partnership and putting aside competitive instincts to work together even with other competitors to try to make everyone's software more safe, secure, and reliable. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you both for coming here to educate us. We all appreciate the opportunity to hear testimony from experts. And I have just a few questions before I'll yield the floor to my colleagues. Mr. Antonelli, I apologize. I haven't had enough coffee this morning.
It's a good Irish name.
In your testimony, you apologized for naming the names of those people who have had breaches of their security in partnership with organized crime. You also mentioned that consumers care deeply and that they're willing to move their money to those who are secure. Now, when I go to a restaurant, I know that the health authorities have checked that restaurant and have the ability to close it down. I'm not suggesting that we close down those businesses that have a breach, but why shouldn't we mandate the disclosure that an insider has breached the trust of these consumers? How else are consumers to make good decisions?
Is this on? Hello? Can you guys hear
Could
me?
we get the table mics on?
Hello? Hello? Can you guys hear? Here we go. All right, now it's on.
Thank you.
When I commented on AOL, I didn't mean to say that I didn't think they had a responsibility. I just think that I didn't mean to just single them out, because I actually think a lot of companies have problems, so I don't want to just single them out as sort of the only one that has a problem. But I do think actually that notification is an important part of the process. I mean, it is, if a company has an asset which is not theirs, they have, I think, an obligation to protect it and have a responsibility to protect it. So that asset is actually someone else's information. So I think that notification when there is an incident has to be part of the process, without a doubt. So,
Ms. Davidson, would you like to add anything? No? Oh, okay. Well, then a question for you. You mentioned the idea of licensing. And one of the things that we've heard from other testimony recently is the need for more education, the need for more money to be spent training students. Do you think it's early to put a licensing regime in place when we're hearing from professors at our leading universities that they're not quite sure what to put into a computer security curriculum?
I don't think it's too early, because there are certainly, I'm sure that since I got my mechanical engineering degree many moons ago, even though I'm only 26, that there's certainly aspects of the curriculum which has changed, but I suspect that the basic core curriculum has not. There is a core body of knowledge that engineers take, statics, dynamics, calculus and so forth, that I suspect has not changed. Perhaps there is more computer time associated with that. So I think basic principles of secure coding, even though the languages change, are probably very fundamental. And I know that it isn't being taught because I'm privileged to work with brilliant developers, but we're effectively having to go through and do remedial coding class. We've actually developed a worldwide training program, mandatory, worldwide, web-based, all developers. And if you start checking in errata, we're going to make them go back and take it again. And these people have multiple degrees, and I'm having to teach them basic, check input conditions type of thing. And I'm sure that we are not the only ones, and I'm not insulting the people I work with, but why didn't they get that at university? So given there is some sort of body of core knowledge and basic principles, I don't think it's too early to start talking about what would some sort of licensing scheme look like. And it's not one size fits all. I mean, the construction industry has a lot of things. There are professional engineers who are licensed. There are building codes. There are other multiple layers of things, and we do that so that when you walk into a building like this, you're not wondering whether somebody skimped on the rebar and they forgot to put in a secure foundation. We never think about that. But in software, we think about it all the time. So maybe it won't be perfect, and maybe it's not going to be there tomorrow, but it's not too early to start thinking about it.
Okay, well, thank you. Mr. McGovern, do you have some questions that you'd like to ask? I'll yield the floor to you.
I do. I thank the chairman for some time here, and I thank our guests for coming. I'm concerned, and my constituents are concerned, that the true issue of identity theft or privacy isn't really well understood, or the implications aren't. We had some discussions before the panel started, and I'm concerned that people out there don't understand how much information is being legitimately traded about them, being collected and aggregated and resold. For less than $50, you can go out, and for any individual who you know the name of and the zip code they live in, you can pull the residences that they've lived in for the last 10 years, the people that have lived with them, the property that they've owned, court records. You can, for a nominal fee, for any telephone number, pull up the call data records. In other words, the people that have been called from that phone number for the last month or two. So you can figure out who is somebody called with their cell phone, when did they call them, how long did they stay on the line with them. And this information is out there and it's being legitimately traded. I'm thankful to companies like Citigroup and such who have brought, through the use of humor in their ads, the concept of identity theft to the forefront of consumers. But I'm concerned that the true issues aren't really understood yet, and that we're quickly approaching a Blade Runner-like situation where large organizations such as the casino we're sitting in understand a lot about us, and we don't even understand what they're watching. They understand the people we associate with, the activities we undertake, the money we spend, the money we don't spend. And I'm really interested to hear some of your opinions, because as two people who are really involved in helping people protect sensitive data, either by producing products that help ensure security or producing products that help ensure security but also help manage the data, I'd be very interested to hear what your opinions are as to what's motivating your customers to actually purchase the security products. Is it the demand from the consumers, or is it legislation? And as a follow-on, I'd be very interested to understand what your products provide to your customers that would then flow down through to the consumers. Because I really believe it's important that the consumers, the people in this room, are probably very savvy to it, but my mother and father, I can tell you, aren't, and most of the general consumers aren't. Is there reporting or capabilities that your products provide that when they're being used, consumers can actually be receiving reporting and feedback on what's going on?
But before I answer your question, I'd like to posit a scenario, and we'll see how the audience reacts. So let's say that you go to a website, let's say it's Amazon, and they say, welcome Mary Ann. We noticed that based on your last 12 purchases, there's a brand new book out that we think is a topic that's near and dear to your heart. It's a military history of the Navy, and it's been well reviewed, and we think you might like it. Now, if you got an email like that, let's say I didn't even log into the website, I got an email like that, you might think, gee, that is really good customer service. They really know me. I had not heard of that book, and I'm going to go check it out. Now, if you received a similar email, welcome Mary Ann, or hello Mary Ann, interesting books on subject matter such and such, we think you'll be interested in it, and it were from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, what would your reaction be? Well, you wouldn't think wonderful customer service, you would think probably, well, how do they know that? So I'm not, advocating anything particular. I'm just saying the information that people collect on your purchases that private industry have is probably better than what the government has. And the government doesn't get access to that currently. So the question, so what do we do about this? One person's convenience is another person's big brother, but it's just data. And it's just data aggregation, it's just data mining. The question is who's doing it and for what purpose? So getting back to your question, what do we do? In terms of actually protecting data, we can protect data down to the level of a single element of data and restrict it so that it's enforced on the data and you can't get at it in some different way, like going through a different application. And we do this because our most security-aware customers demanded it, whom I refer to as the professional paranoids, and I'm sure you know who they are without my naming them. And we can label it as well. So if you want to put a classification on it, anything from company confidential or personally identifiable information, doctor only, we can do that. The problem you're really alluding to is data aggregation, which is that everyone leaves a digital footprint. And companies, in a way rightly so, want to know more about their customers. to the point where if you, some of you probably know this, that if you buy from a particular company, the catalog that they give you, even if it's the same household, may be different for the husband and wife based on what they buy. If the wife buys mostly things for children, the catalog she gets is going to have mostly children's clothes in it. Some people might think this is intrusive. Other people think, no, this is, I want to know my customer. It's targeted one-to-one marketing.
What I'm really interested in getting at, though, is it seems as though feedback to the consumers is important. So, for instance, the fact that my call data records are out there and can be purchased, granted, doesn't pose an issue to me, but to some people I believe it would. That I would know who you're talking to and who you're not. So where the information goes after we surrender it, whether we overtly know we are or not, I think is really important. I'm very interested, you mentioned training, and I was very interested to know if Oracle or Ubuntu is actually working actively to educate either your customers or your customers' customers. Is there a way that you're making it clear or reporting back to them as to what's going on once the information is surrendered?
Well, we do things in a couple ways. First of all, we are, just as we've made security part of our development process, I've got secure coding standards, we train people on it, we have exit criteria for security, we're doing the same thing, we're beginning to do the same thing for privacy. Privacy is part of our security training. So we want the developer to think, before you build this application, understand there's something called personally identifiable information, and maybe someone's building an application on top of what we do, but that customer has to worry about it because of their customers or because of national privacy laws. So before we start writing basic products, we need to know that the people who are deploying them are going to have to deal with this. And then we have to help our customers say, here's what we offer you to be able to restrict access, report on it. Here's what has to be collected. And for certain requirements like SB 1386, for example, what we actually did is go through all of our products, not just one of them, all of them, and identify for our customers, here is the information, how it's stored, where it's stored, in every product that we have that is subject to this law, so that you know where it is. You don't have to hire a consultant to go find this.
Great. I'd be very interested. Now, Vantu, my understanding is your product helps companies actually monitor what's going on, so you can see insider activities where they're using information. What sort of reporting or capabilities might that provide to consumers? How would they know what's going on or not?
So I think what's interesting is we sort of sit at the opposite ends of the spectrum, where Oracle's where it's stored, and what we're trying to do is sit at the edge of the network and see when data is leaving, either inappropriately or potentially maliciously. And the interesting, you asked an interesting question. You asked a lot of interesting questions. Like a good legislator, you talked for 3 minutes and you had to figure out what the question was. But one of the things that you mentioned was why do companies care? What drives them to actually do something around data security, data privacy? Is it regulation? Is it concern about the consumer? And I think it's a little bit of both. And the thing that I am most concerned about is actually when we have legislation that forces companies to not want to do certain things and put their head in the sand. But I think in terms of how can we help, I do think that notification is a big part of the process for consumers, and a lot of what we do is help companies know where and when data is leaving, and to be able to either A, put better processes in place, or if it's something that's inappropriate, to be able to say, okay, here's the data that left, we have to notify those folks. We don't necessarily provide an automated way to do that because we want the companies to have that obligation and responsibility, but that first step is knowing. What is it, the 12 steps? The first step in the 12-step process is admit you have a problem. So what we're trying to do is let them know if they have a problem.
That's great.
Okay. Thank you for your questions, Mark. But in the interest of time, I'm going to ask that we yield the floor to Ms. Dragone. Excuse me.
I'm not, we haven't done that yet.
No. But we know if you had.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our distinguished guests for sharing your background on what are two very, very key issues, and at many points very intertwined, the crossroads between security and privacy. In the pre-read testimonial, Mr. Antonelli, you addressed your tool capability, and I know you didn't really address it here, but it does pose a few underlying questions that I want to share. Your tool solution is one that allows corporations to track and monitor information that is being sent from a corporate enterprise out through emails and FTP, et cetera. One of the interesting things about your technology solution, as well as the problem that it's trying to solve, is it puts you in a very unique role of having security and privacy, although intertwined and obviously very critical in the privacy space. You also see both ends of a spectrum from a tension standpoint. You've got what can be deemed appropriate corporate security risk management, and at the other end of the spectrum, you potentially have what could be seen as a violation of expected employee privacy rights. We in Congress have been looking into this area, and we know that there are other technology solutions where you can actually scan the tone of what's being said in emails. So if somebody was to write, I need to get a new job, or this company sucks, you actually can start profiling people based on their conversation and their dialogue through emails, and start, if necessary, pinpointing a little bit more of a focused look perhaps on those people from a potential risk standpoint. In the EU, particularly where every single citizen of the EU has a basic human right deemed by law in the EU Data Directive to own their personal data, there is more legislation coming about regarding work surveillance and how to prevent Big Brother type activities. As we in Congress expect the same style of legislation to come down our path, particularly as employees discover they have rights the same way that consumers have discovered they have privacy rights, even though in America, we've been accused of giving away our DNA just to get a free hamburger. We're getting smarter about what our rights are. Employees are going to be in that same space. As we see this legislation, what would you recommend as a set of principles upon which we should guide ourselves to discern between what is appropriate security risk management for a corporation at one end of the spectrum, and what is a violation or inappropriate delving into behaviors, dialogues, perceptions, and other kinds of behaviors of employees?
That's a really good set of questions, actually. This issue around employee privacy and data protection or data privacy, there's definitely a tension there. If you work for, pick your large bank, and you're an employee, you don't necessarily want to feel like, okay, they're looking at my email. But let's say you have an account with $50,000 at that bank, you might want to say, yeah, I want to make sure that my information isn't going outside of the bank. So there's definitely a tension there. And we get this question a lot when we go in and meet with companies. And the thing that is, I think, critically important is transparency. The best way to deal and solve with this problem is that companies need to be very transparent with the people in the company of what they're doing. And that typically also serves as a way to stop problems, because if people know that you're looking for something, then they might not do it, whether or not you're even doing it. There's a funny story about it was a industrial engineering study that was done where they wanted to see the impact of changes on a production line, and so they came in and did these tests, and they installed all of these lights so that they could videotape all these people on the production line, and they saw in that area that there was an increase in production. The next week they moved the lights to a different set of the production line, and that section, actually, the production went up, and the productivity went up, and then where they took the lights from, it went down. So I think there's a thing about if people know that you're sort of looking for something, I think it actually can change behavior. And I think if you're transparent about it, at the end of the day, consumer data protection is what that company's about, so they need to better protect it.
I have several suggestions for how you can maintain this appropriate tension. One of them is that you need to start with something called an acceptable use policy. In other words, if you don't have some definition within a company of here's what you're allowed to do with company resources and here's what you're not allowed to do, what is acceptable use, then you run the risk of monitoring everything in the attempt to hit an extremely vague target. So with vagueness comes, I think, probably a resentment that Big Brother really is watching you. Second of all, I think notification would be important. In other words, that if you tell employees, we have an acceptable use policy, we're monitoring you for the following specific things and the following specific purposes, which may vary by job classification. You may have more surveillance of, for example, administrators of your corporate secrets than you would for somebody who's merely emptying the trash. Then again, it's not so much that Big Brother is watching, is that you know what Big Brother is watching for and for what purposes. What you're monitoring should be related to specific policies. In other words, if you don't have a corporate policy against calling an executive vice president a big fat idiot, then finding that in an email shouldn't be grounds for termination, unless there's something specific related to that violates another policy. Because after all, it's just someone's opinion, and it may even be accurate.
Is someone you're referring to?
No one I know. And last, but certainly not least, you should guard against the unintentional use. In other words, if you're collecting data for a specific purpose, you need to resist the temptation to use it for something else. And thereby, so no scope creep. I think again, within some framework, if you adhere to those basic principles, then you will be able to monitor employees for the things that you have a legitimate right to monitor, you've told your employees you're not using it for something else, and you're not going after them for something they did that's incidental, that has nothing to do with their actual performance and what your corporate policies are.
Thank you. We have time for just a couple of quick questions from the audience.
All right. I'd just like to remark, I think that there's a fundamental problem that I see that the testimony is simply ignored. I believe what we're dealing with in many respects is that we've gotten here to the point where we're asking people to do things that are technologically not possible. You're asking people to keep too many secrets. Consider all of the bank account numbers and social security numbers and checking account numbers and so forth. And these are all used for identification. They're all fixed, and they're all numbers that get spread all over the place. You know, we don't have right now decent ways for anybody to know who someone else is without trying to share a lot of these secrets. And we share so many of them that they spread all over the place. It's simply not possible with the technology we have to keep that many secrets. This is probably a problem with the military classification as well, but I'll leave that to one side. There are two ways to deal with that. The first is to try and get technology into customers' hands.
Could you wrap it up and turn it into a question, please, sir? Okay, well, actually, I think we've actually exceeded our time. We've got people coming in for the next session. So I apologize for the lack of question time, but let's thank our speakers.
You don't use unique identifiers for